Good evening. Good evening. Tonight we have the honor of hosting a speaker who really needs no introduction. People say that a lot, but this is really true. Jeff Shaara, a name synonymous with this town and beloved by history enthusiasts around the world. And it's such a privilege to have him here as we mark the beginning of a weekend of events celebrating the 30th anniversary of the movie Gettysburg and Michael Shaara's incredible masterpiece that sparked it all. Jeff Shaara was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey, but raised in Tallahassee, Florida. After attending Florida State University, he became a rare coin and precious metals dealer and established a thriving retail store known throughout the region. But in 1988, Jeff's trajectory changed course when his father passed away at the young age of 59. Jeff made the difficult decision to sell his business and take on the mantle of managing his father's estate. In 1993, following the success of the motion picture Gettysburg, Jeff was approached to continue the narrative by crafting a prequel and a sequel, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Despite lacking prior writing experience, Jeff embraced the challenge, and it led to the publication of Gods and Generals in 1996, which swiftly soared to success and claimed a spot on the New York Times bestseller list for 15 weeks straight. In the years since, Jeff has penned a series of best-selling historical novels covering various wars, including the American Revolution, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the World War I, World War II, and Korea. And of course, his latest book, which you can get downstairs, is The Old Lion, which explores the life and times of Teddy Roosevelt. Jeff's dedication to meticulously chronicling the narratives of significant historical events and figures has earned him accolades, notably the William Young Boyd Award from the American Library Association, which he's now been awarded 4 times. Jeff, his wife Stephanie, and daughter Emma live here in Gettysburg, and their unwavering support for local organizations like ACHS has truly made a difference in our community. And I've gotten to know Jeff on a personal note over the past few years, and I have to say he's one of the most humble and gracious people that I've had the privilege of working with. And I don't know many authors of his caliber, but I imagine that few are as generous with their time or as eager to engage with readers as he is. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, joined by filmmaker Jake Borrett, please welcome our special guest tonight, my good friend, Jeff Shaara.
There are a lot of you.
I feel like a psychiatrist. Tell me about your father.
That's his sole purpose for being here, is to ask that question. Well, let's see. What do you want to know?
Well, I mean, he's so tied to Gettysburg and obviously the Killer Angels and all that comes from that, but his story is much bigger and both kind of triumphant, tragic, and your relationship with him, I know, is complex. And I mean, we can almost start at the beginning or before the beginning. I know you've done some of the research on his ancestry, but where does he come from and how does he get to the point that we know him?
Well, my father is first generation Italian. He was born in 1928. His father, my grandfather, was born in Italy and came over when he was about 5 years old through Ellis Island, like so many did. And he married, I mean, my mother is German, and so that was an interesting combination. But my father's, and this leads to something I'll talk about later on, my father's mother, my grandmother, was from Texas, and her maiden name was Maxwell. And that has relevance, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. But no, he grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey. That's where he was born. He went to school there. He went to college at Rutgers University, and that's where he became a writer. He started. That's what he always wanted to do, was be a writer. He published his first short story in the Rutgers newspaper at 20 years old, and that started a career. I mean, by the time he was finished, he had written 70 short stories, including mostly science fiction. He was big on science fiction. And those of you who are of a certain age, and actually probably not any of you are that certain age, in the early 50s, there were a lot of pulp magazines, the Sci-Fi Galaxy and Astounding, and all these magazines that were around you could buy for a dime. That's where his stuff was published. And I can remember he got a penny a word. And when I was a little kid, one of my jobs was to count the words. And then I can remember actually when it became 2 cents a word, and that was like, wow, you know, the ship had come in then. But you know, he was a short story writer. That's what he did. And then he began leaving the science fiction world a little bit. And by the way, when I mention him in sci-fi, if you know names like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury, the biggies in science fiction, my father was one of those. He was very, very highly regarded and knew all those people. All those people were up in New Jersey, New York, and they kind of knew each other. So it was not a stretch for him to call Ray Bradbury and have a conversation. He went to straight fiction, and there's a photograph of him. Well, that's not the one. There's a photograph of him as a policeman. He was a policeman in 1955. We moved to St. Petersburg, Florida, from New Jersey, and he became a cop. And his purpose for doing that was to get experience for writing something. He wanted to find out what it was really like to be a cop. If he was going to write about it, he needed to know that. And he did. And the result of that, he wrote a story that was published in Playboy called The Peeping Tom Patrol. And yeah, you draw your own conclusions. But it was, it was very successful, and he did a whole anthology of straight fiction that covered a lot of police work, a lot of other things similar to that. But always in the back of his head, he wanted to write a book. And he didn't really know how to write a book, and I can relate to that. But he started working on it in the early 60s, and he wrote a story of a Korean War veteran who comes home from the war, and he becomes a prize fighter. And he becomes a boxer. He's in the ring. And I don't have a picture of it, but my father did that. That's something else he had experience when he was in the Army, in the 82nd Airborne, and there is a picture of him in Army uniform. He jumped out of airplanes. More power to him. But the purpose of that, again, the experience led to this story of the Korean War vet who kills a guy in the ring. You know, a horrible tragedy that happens every now and then in boxing. And he wrote that book, and the book is called The Broken Place. And it was published in 1968 by Little Brown and did absolutely nothing. They didn't really promote it. The book didn't sell. That was a bitter disappointment because he really was happy about having written his first novel. And, you know, everybody dreams if you write your first novel, and I can relate to this too, that, you know, good things are going to come out of it. And in fact, nothing came out of it for him. But he was working on something else at the time, and this is where we sort of get to now. In 1964, some of you, I know a bunch of you have heard this story before, but I'll tell it again. In 1964, my father took his family to Gettysburg just to see it. We were tourists. We had been to the New York World's Fair. And we sort of took a side trip coming over to Gettysburg, driving back to Florida. And we wandered the ground, and my father had done some reading and certain books. And so he sort of knew what he was looking at a little bit. But the more he walked the ground, the more excited he got. He was always a storyteller. The more he walked the ground at Gettysburg, the more he realized this was a story. And it's a story he wanted to tell. He started working on it after he had finished The Broken Place. He started working on the book. It took 7 years to come up with a manuscript. I mean, here's a little bit of the biographical stuff, is that he was a teacher at Florida State. English, literature, Shakespeare, and he taught to make a living. Because even with all the short stories, I mean, when you got paid $200 for a short story, that's really not going to pay a lot of your bills.
But Jeff, he got to Florida State not to be a writing teacher, right?
No, he got to Florida State to be he went there originally. Florida State, if you know, has a tremendous music school. They had a world-class famous opera singer was on the panel there, on the faculty. And I think he wanted to go there. He actually dreamed of being an opera singer. It didn't work out so well. But while he was there, the faculty found out that this guy, who's a published author, is hanging around there, and they offered him a job as an instructor in the English department. And he was teaching freshman English, which is sort of like the bottom of the barrel for professors. And then he eventually worked his way up as he became more and more prolific in his writing. And he was the only English professor on the faculty that actually published a novel. And the joke always was, maybe you've heard this, if you can't do, teach. And that was his opinion of the people of his peers. He didn't get along very well with the other people in the English department. One guy was a poet. He really didn't get along with him. But when he started working on this book about the Battle of Gettysburg, and I remember the research that would come into the house, because it was, unlike today, where there's the internet and there's websites like A Libris that you can go find everything, out of print, rare books, and they're shipped to your door. No, he had to go, it was the library lending program. He could go to the FSU library and ask for a certain book, and they would search and find other universities that might have it in their library, and they would send it. They would mail it, and it might take 3 months to track down a single book. And I remember when he had stacks of books in our house, because he was reading all of this stuff voraciously. He was a midnight to 5 a.m. writer. He taught in the afternoon. He would sleep about 5 in the morning. He would sleep till noon and then go teach in the afternoon. Again, the teaching is the only way he could make a living. My mother worked for the state of Florida for 37 years to pay the bills because he could not with his writing. And that was something I think he carried with him a lot. When he was working on the Gettysburg story, he finished the manuscript roughly in about 1971, 72, right in there. And he started shopping it. He had an agent in New York, and so they started, flogging it around the different publishers. Nobody was interested. If you think about 1972, what was happening in this country? The Vietnam War. And it was winding down. People were sick of it. It was a terrible, the government was trying desperately to get out of it. Nobody wanted to read a book about war, certainly not the Civil War. It was extremely out of fashion as a subject. Well, my father persevered, and he was used to getting the rejection notices. My mother used to hide the rejection notices so he wouldn't see them. That's how tough it was. And he finally, a small independent publisher, the David McKay Company, in 1973 said, we'll give you $3,500. He took it. They published, and the book was called, and there were a lot of different titles of the book. One of the titles was Gods and Generals. Somebody else took that title and made use of it. He called it The Killer Angels. The book came out in 1974 to no great expectation, because again, consider the era, consider what was in vogue at the time. The book came out in 74 and sort of floundered a little bit, didn't really do much commercially. That $3,500 was looking pretty good at the time. And they tried, they promoted it as best they could. And then it was getting to the point where it was forgotten about, which is what happens to a lot of unsuccessful books. And in April of 1975, a telegram comes to my parents' house, which, by the way, the telegram is here in the museum. Congratulations, you have been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Now, I remember, the excitement of that. And I've said this many times before, a writer wins a Pulitzer Prize. He has every right to believe his ship has come in. This is it. Now I'm going to be a star. They're going to fight over my next book. There'll be an auction to say who's going to pay me the most for my next book. That's usually the way it works. None of that happened to him. He went on to the bitterness of that. It was bitterness. That he had written this book that was recognized the way it was, and nobody cared. And he was offered a couple other contracts. Nobody wanted another Civil War book. People are always asking me, what other historical works did he write? The answer is none, because he didn't want to. He had done his thing. He went on, he wrote a book called The Herald, which is a Hitchcock sci-fi sort of story that is really gripping for about the first third of it, and then the rest of it sort of falls apart because he was falling apart. It was a reflection on what he was going through in his life.
He had gone to Italy at one point to teach, right? And that sort of affected him pretty dramatically.
Well,
right?
that's another topic. In 1972, FSU has a program in Florence where if you're an art student, humanities student, and they'll take just so many students, and you can go over there and they have a campus, and you go for 6 months. And they have a certain number of faculty, like maybe 6 or 8 people, that go over to teach. He was one of them. He decided to get around Italy, not riding the bus, but he got a Vespa. If you know what a Vespa is, it's a little scooter. My father was 6'2" and weighed 215 pounds. The inevitable happened. He was run off the road and cracked his skull pretty good, and he was in the hospital for 3 months. And he was in a coma for 3 weeks. And my mother, I was here, and my mother was calling and keeping me posted on what was going on. And I ended up flying over there in May of '72, and flew over for a month. The symptoms of what had happened to him were very much like a stroke, a major stroke. He was walking with a cane. He couldn't speak very well. He couldn't process, if you were talking to him, he couldn't process it. And it gradually got better, but it was really tough for him. We used to try to get him to get up and walk with the cane, just to exercise it, do something. But it was pretty tough. And I believe absolutely that it affected his writing. And the Herald is a really good example of that, because he starts out great and then just goes downhill. And by the end of the book, it's just not a very good book. He wrote another story that I can talk about that now. He wrote a baseball story. Baseball was his love. When it came to sports, even though he was in Florida where football is king, baseball is what he always loved. He was a New York Giants fan, followed Willie Mays, followed Mel Ott. And when I was a kid, I learned all this. I learned about Willie Mays, and so he became my hero too. But baseball was his sport, and I think what he wrote was his own fantasy of what he wanted, what he would have liked to have done as a baseball player. He wrote the story of an aging pitcher who's at the end of his career. He's been his entire career with one team, and he goes out, it's the end of the season, the team is in last place, and the game really doesn't mean anything. They're playing the Yankees, which is the big behemoth enemy, and of course the Yankees are playing for a position in the postseason, so the game means something to the Yankees. He goes out on the mound, and for 9 innings, he throws a perfect game. And those of you who may realize or who recognize this story know that it was eventually made into a film with Kevin Costner and Kelly Preston, and it was called For Love of the Game. And that movie, the book was published, and the movie came out long after Gettysburg. And so he didn't really live to see that.
Jeff, how did you find out about that story? If it wasn't published until I'll get to that. That's good. No, because I need to tell you, my father was going downhill to the extent that his heart disease, his first heart attack was when he was 36 years old in 1965. His second heart attack in 1988 killed him. Died in his sleep. He was 59 years old. He was a 4-pack-a-day man. Wow. Yeah. Well, at the time of his death, nothing was happening with any of his work, particularly, and my mother and I were going through his files, and I found the name of this manuscript. The name was Billy Boy. It's like, what is this? I had no idea. And she said, oh, it's his baseball story. So, okay, so I read it and thought, well, this maybe is saleable. In the meantime, Robert Redford had made The Natural, and you had Bull Durham and Field of Dreams, all these baseball stories. Baseball was sort of hot. So I took it to New York, and it was published by Carroll and Graff, and they changed the title from Billy Boy to For Love of the Game. And the book did fairly well. It wasn't a big hit by any means. It certainly wasn't a bestseller.
But it was respectable. But what happened was that Universal Pictures found out about it. Kevin Costner found out about it, and they jumped all over it. And they were going to make a movie. It took about 7 years. But I have to say, the film Gettysburg came out in 1993, 5 years after my father's death. For Love of the Game came out in 1999. That's twice that I have sat in a movie theater when the credits come up on the screen and it says, based on the novel by Michael Shaara. Twice that he didn't live to see. So when I start talking about his life and his times, that's always there. That's always, that my writing career would not exist if he had lived. Because, I would never have written Gods and Generals, he would have. They would have come to him. Ron Maxwell would have come to him and said, Ted Turner wants to make more movies. Wouldn't it be great to take the Killer Angels and go in both directions with some of the same characters and tell the same kind of story? And that's what I did. Had he been alive, that would have been his. I don't know what I'd be doing today. Maybe building houses or something. So.
That's fascinating. So that it really, the success that we attribute to Michael Shaara, other than the Pulitzer Prize, he was aware of none of it.
No, absolutely not. In fact, even with the Pulitzer Prize, every writer has the right to expect his book will become a bestseller. Didn't happen. The Killer Angels sold, it became, I hate this description, it became a cult book. If you were a Civil War fanatic, Civil War buff, I hate that term, if you were a historian that specialized in Civil War, you might use it in your classroom, and some did. If you were a reenactor, there were some in the 70s and early 80s, you might know about the Killer Angels. But other than that, it really didn't get very much attention at all. And again, a Pulitzer Prize. And that was a bitter disappointment to him. And that was one of the things that sort of pushed him to writing other things besides Civil War. There was something different from the Killer Angels because he really wanted to put that behind him.
And even though he never wrote another historical or Civil War novel, you spent time with him on the battlefield here, and your connection to Gettysburg came out of, that original trip you mentioned, but you came again to Gettysburg with him, right?
Well, even in '64, and there's some pictures of us up here that keep flashing by. That's him in a classroom. In '64, we were, we were tourists, so we were wandering all over the place. We came back in about 1968, and now, I'm the kid, but I'm older now, and so I can do stuff, and he couldn't because of his heart attack. So, for example, climbing Big Round Top, going to the top and looking and seeing what's there on the summit. He wanted to know, and he couldn't make the climb, but I could. So, I was I did the grunt work, which was, and that's probably the closest I have ever been to my father was that experience. Because we had fun, and I've tried to figure out based on the motels around here where we stayed, and actually there's me. Yeah. I don't think they let you climb up on that thing anymore. So, but it was a marvelous experience researching with him. And by the way, people have taken this little piece of information and they introduced me at events that I was a consultant on the Killer Angels, or that I helped my father write the book. I heard that. I promise you that is not the case. This is his monument, and I don't deserve any credit for Killer Angels. In fact, the book, it's been around as of next year, 50 years. Yeah, 2024. Well, the publisher has asked me on more than one occasion to write an introduction for the book, which is logical, I guess, from their point of view. I won't do it. I won't put the book doesn't need me to make it any better. And I beg off. I'd just rather not put my words in my father's book.
But those words that are in the book came out of telling stories on this battlefield. Probably yards from here and miles from here. And so you have stories of walking around, and he approached it as a story. and he was walking around. I remember one in particular you told about crossing Pickett's Charge.
Well, yeah, that story I've told very, very often. And it was the most significant moment of our trip here in '64. My father and I took the walk, many of you have done it, from the Lee statue, the Virginia Monument, across the field up to the copse of trees. And I'm clueless. I mean, I don't know the history. He's telling me what happened. He's telling me about Armistead and you know, going across that field, walking up to the guns commanded by his friend Winfield Hancock. And, you know, so we're going through the grass and kicking through, and he's telling me all of this. And we get up, we cross the Emmitsburg Road, and we start going up the hill, and he's telling me what it was like for the Confederates going up that hill, and how they were getting enfilade fire from one side, and they were just getting butchered. And we get up to the stone wall, and we step over, and we cross over, and, you know, and we're sort of tired. And there's a small, and I know most of you know this, there's a small concrete monument a few yards up the hill from the stone wall. We didn't know what that was. The odd thing about it is there was a Confederate flag sticking out of the ground. Well, we're on the Union side of the line, so that didn't make a lot of sense. So we walked up, and you know, my father looked at the monument. It's the place where Lewis Armistead fell. And at that moment, my father started to weep. I'm 12. I've never seen my father cry before. And I realize now, looking back on that going across that field and what he was doing, he was Armistead. I mean, this was the story he was going to tell, and the story that you know is in the Killer Angels. But that's how he put it together. That's how he came upon that story, by walking the ground. That lesson has stayed with me through every book I've written. Whenever it's possible, I've gone to the ground, walk the ground, walk in the footsteps of the characters. That's what he did. And I'll tell this story, the only place I could not go, there are a couple of them, but one in particular, I wrote a book on the Korean War, The Frozen Hours, about the Chosin Reservoir, the Marines at Chosin. And I wanted to see the Chosin Reservoir. I thought that would be cool, go to Korea and see this place and walk the ground and so forth. And to my surprise, I found out that the Chosin Reservoir is in North Korea. The State Department, I talked to a guy at the State Department, he actually told me, we can get you in. And my wife said, no, we're not entertaining that, no. So I could not go to the Chosin Reservoir. But that lesson is learned. And because I know how it affected my father, and I know how much it must have added to the Killer Angels, is that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, clearly it affected you. I remember we talked with Ken Burns on this stage a few months ago, and what motivated him to become a filmmaker was when his dad cried at a movie, the only time he heard his dad cry. And sort of this father crying motivation for his son's career seems to be a theme of this stage here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a vulnerability that most sons never see. And, I mean, I can remember when my grandmother died, when my father's mother died, I was 10. And he came home from the hospital and told me she was gone, but he wasn't crying. I mean, he was sad. I mean, it's a devastating day, but there were no tears. This time there were tears. And not after, before or after did I ever see that again.
Wow, so the only time you saw your father cry at that moment was through the story of Armistead.
That's my mother. She was a knockout. Not so much a knockout.
Speaking of Little Round Top, Chamberlain, your father is such a crucial role in the transformation of Chamberlain's understanding of this battle. What was it like being on Little Round Top with him? And do you remember the details of that that land?
Well, the same thing. The effect. I mean, he's looking. He's doing. He's scoping it all out. I think by the time we got to Little Round Top, he had read the book "The 20th Maine" by John Pullen, very well known history book, and so he had the background. He knew the history, and why he picked Chamberlain. Out of, he could have picked Strong Vincent, who was killed. He could have picked someone from the New York Regiment or Pennsylvania Regiment. But no, he stuck with the 20th Maine. And I think the reason is he identified with Joshua Chamberlain. Here's a man who's an academic, a college professor, who wants action, who wants to go to war. That probably is a pretty accurate description of my father.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was a rough and tumble guy, right? He had a boxing background.
Well, I mentioned the paratroopers. He, the 82nd Airborne. He was between the wars. He was not in the war. He was in the 82nd, like 1947, 48. But yes, he became a boxer. I think he had something like 17 or 18 fights, and he was pretty good at it. And he became a cop. So I think part of him, he admired Hemingway. He loved him. He taught Hemingway at FSU. And I think he wanted to be Hemingway. I think something in him just, wanted to be that a Hemingway-esque kind of a character. Joshua Chamberlain was. And I think that really affected him.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, clearly your career path didn't start. You had no plans to follow in your father's footsteps for the first half of your life, basically, right? In fact, you were probably avoiding them, right?
Well, and I avoided it. One of the reasons why is what I've talked about is his writing career was a failure. And I mean, he was always, his relationship with writing was adversarial. He was always in a fight with his agent, with an editor, with a publisher. As a kid, I remember him yelling into the phone. That's his relationship with writing. Well, as a kid, what on earth would inspire me to want to do that? Especially since he wasn't making a living at it. There was no money in it. So no, there was no incentive on my part to do this at all.
And he's long gone, and you're now in his footsteps and surpassed his footsteps with many, many books, bestsellers. Are there things that you would ask him now if you could? I mean, this great writer you never asked him once about how to write historical fiction, which is sort of this irony of your relationship.
I mean, the single connection to our relationship is what I've already mentioned, that, Gods and Generals was his original title for the Killer Angels. But I don't know what I would ask him now. I'm not sure how he would feel about my career and what's happened to me, because he carried 40 years of bitterness. And I'll say this. This is I don't air dirty laundry, but this isn't that. My mother asked me one time, after about 4 or 5 books of mine had come out, why is the good stuff happening to you? So, the good stuff has happened to me. The good stuff didn't happen to him. And it really, when Gods and Generals came out, and it's a bestseller, and I'm going around the country, the publisher sent me out to 59 cities as a tour, because they wanted to introduce me, not the father. This is the son. And that was what the marketing people talked about. So they sent me all over hell and God. I was on the road for 4 months. I had a very difficult time standing up on a stage like this, or in a bookstore, or at a podium somewhere, holding up a copy of Gods and Generals and saying, look what I did. Because it wasn't mine. It wasn't mine to write. It was his. And I had a tough time with that for quite a while. Thankfully, I've gotten over that. But it was difficult. And, that's always somewhere in the back of my head.
Well, absolutely, yeah. Then you can't.
There's him as a cop.
Why did you end up in Florida?
With a cigarette in his hand, by the way.
Well, you said, I remember you told me once your job as a kid was to empty
the ashtrays every morning. The house had, 6 ashtrays, I guess, or 5, something like that. Every one of them would be overflowing. That was my job, was to go around in the morning and empty all the ashtrays. I don't know if I ever got any kind of secondhand damage from that or something. But I mean, that was, you know, everywhere he was, there was a cigarette. And in the car, we would be driving. I don't know how much secondhand smoke, you know, there was in our family, but he always had he smoked Viceroys.
Wow.
That's one of my favorite pictures, by the way.
Where is that?
That's in Inverness, Florida. I'm about 3 years old. He loved to fish. That's a black drum, in case you're wondering. He was skinny back then.
And so, I mean, you've always loved outdoor stuff, too. So, I mean, that came from your dad, too? Like the fishing, hunting, stuff like that?
I think so. He wasn't a big hunter. He was mostly just a fisherman. And I mean, growing up in Tallahassee and in the North Florida, South Georgia, as a woods and water kid. I mean, I learned when I was a teenager, I learned how to deer hunt, and I, you know, did all that stuff for a while. I don't do any of it anymore. He had a rifle, but he never fired it. I mean, he would never go out with his rifle and do anything. So it was strictly as a fisherman. I don't think they allow people to do that anymore. That's my sister, by the way.
Wow, I haven't seen a lot of that. I mean, I remember you showed me some of these, but it's amazing.
Yep.
So you have this entire, I mean, this is you pre even the Killer Angels. You're out there, and now the millions and tens of millions, I'm sure, people that have come to this field, in large part because they've read the book, they've seen the movie, they've read your work. And it's this influence, but it all started with these trips here. And why is that so vital to kind of share that story with your kids, with your son? And I mean, your dad was both a professional thing, but for most people, it's just a family trip. A lot of times, probably dragging kids kicking and screaming, or not. But why is that so crucial? And
well, Ken Burns and I actually talked about this on the stage. That what is it about this place that is so special? What is it that draws people? What is it that drew all of you? Well, I mean, there's no easy answer. It's the history. People want to know the facts. They want people want to pick up all the books with all the historical accounts. So that's fine. That's a good thing. People want to read, want to walk in the footsteps of Robert E. Lee because their great-great-granddaddy walked in the footsteps of Robert E. Lee. Fine. That's a perfectly legitimate reason for being here. On the other hand, I mean, there are a lot of people who realize this is an American tragedy that affected everybody who was here. And you can't escape that. You can look at the numbers of the dead and so forth, and that's one thing. The 50-odd thousand casualties, which is horrible enough as it is. But every person that was here that left this ground carried it with him. How it affected them, it came out in different ways. Some people committed suicide. Some people, swore that their children would never put on a uniform. Some people couldn't wait for their kid to put on a uniform. I mean, it affected people in so many different ways, and even into old age, they carried that. It's a tough story, no matter how you look at it. And nobody comes here because they're happy about walking on a battlefield. I mean, maybe I'm saying this badly, but you come to the battlefield and you absorb the significance of that. You know what it means to walk around on this ground. You know when you go up Little Round Top. It's one thing to think about Jeff Daniels screaming bayonets. It's another thing to look up, stand up on that hill and look down where the Confederates came up and realize, my God, how did they do that? And a lot of them, didn't make it the whole way. There are moments like that all over this field. When you had a clash of two armies out of Willoughby's Run, you had the clash of two armies. It was bloody. It was horrible. You walk that and you can feel it. And I don't mean looking for ghosts. I mean, some of you might be into that. That's fine. That's your thing. It's not my thing. But just to feel the impact of the ground, of what happened and how many people didn't survive, and then all the people who did survive, what part of them they left here. What part of them was left behind? You know, how many times they relived it, and what kind of a horror was that for their families. You know, the old story. I mean, I had an ex-father-in-law who served in World War II, and every time, and he lived in Florida. Well, every time there was a thunderstorm, which was often, and there'd be a crack of lightning and, you know, a boom of thunder, he was out the window of the house. That's not an exaggeration, you know, because he was terrified that it was a bomb going off. That's what I mean by the wounds. Those kind of wounds. It's one thing to lose an arm or lose a leg, and there are a lot of those, but the other wounds that people carry with them, that's really something worth exploring. And it starts by walking this ground.
Absolutely, and you did it with your father here, and I mean, you learned it there first as a tourist, then as an assistant, and now you're doing it professionally, you know, many places all over the world, really. Are there other things that you learned from your dad's methods of writing and researching that you take with you?
Well, in the Killer Angels, my father invented the format of the Killer Angels, where you go back and forth from different characters' points of view, and that moves you through the timeline. That, I use the same technique up until every book except my Teddy Roosevelt book, because that's just one point of view, his. But I've done that, exactly that, and where you move back and forth. And it's a way of telling the story so much more completely and so much in a much more three-dimensional way. And you know, people that use the Killer Angels to teach the Battle of Gettysburg in the classroom understand that if you're giving somebody that book, they'll grasp the understanding, the concepts, what happened here, far better than they will if they're just simply reading a dry history book. And I think and my father didn't set out to do that. That's a happy accident of what happened with the Killer Angels.
So it really was an accident? Like he did it like he was figuring out, he used the histories, obviously he used Longstreet's and Chamberlain's and various accounts, and then he just developed that method of telling the story, and then of course he's creating dialogue that comes from them, but it's not historical dialogue usually.
Usually. I mean, occasionally there are quotes, and I've run into this, where there are, you know, there's a letter, or there are quotations that I can use word for word, and the stuff's in the public domain, so there's no, you know, copyright problem with that. There's not much of that in the Killer Angels. And so it's his dialogue. He made it up. The danger in that, and this is one thing that historians will harp on, the danger is that someone will take a quote. Joshua Chamberlain says something in the Killer Angels. Somebody takes that and uses it as an historical quote. You know, that, well, you know, Chamberlain said that, you know, and it's happened to me. In the last full measure, I have a Grant having a conversation, and he says something about the nature of fighting a war, that you need to fight it completely, and you know, don't hold anything back, you know, something like that. And I'm paraphrasing. And somebody wrote a letter to the editor of the Washington Post, in which he was complaining about something that George Bush was doing or something, but he says in Jeff Shaara's book, Ulysses Grant says, and he gives the quote. And reading that, you think that's what Ulysses Grant said. No, it's not. It's what Jeff Shaara said. But that's the danger.
I think that's what Ken would say. You won there, Jeff. Like, that's like you succeeded. Well, I mean, it's fascinating to hear this and to hear sort of the methods that you use, and obviously the influence of the place. Do you feel him when you're out there?
This is after the motorcycle accident.
Okay, that's Italy?
Yeah, and that's in Italy, and he's not in real good shape there.
I remember, I mean, I met him briefly as a kid. My dad was a teacher at Gettysburg College, as many of you know, and Michael Shaara, and this was before it was a bestseller, but my dad assigned the book to his classes on Civil War, and Michael Shaara came to the college, to the Civil War Institute, and spoke. And then, I mean, he wasn't in good shape. This is probably 86, 87, so he's near the very end of his life. And he wanted to live in a camper by our barn. And my mom said no. I mean, he was a tricky guy at best, right? And it was funny, when you asked me to join you on stage a few days ago, we have an old camper out behind the barn now, totally separate. And I thought of that. What an ironic moment to have Jeff ask me to be on stage to talk about Michael Shaara. There's our camper. But all that to say, I think it's like his spirit lives on because it's in your career, obviously, and what Ken did with his documentary and what Ron and Ted Turner did with the film, and then so many of us. And so I think even though he saw none of the financial success and very little other success, he's a hugely successful writer. I mean, do you look at it as a tragedy? Do you look at it as heroic? I mean, you have the personal, you have the professional, but how do you take his life?
Well, I think I honor his legacy. Every copy of The Killer Angels that I signed, and I've signed a potload of them, and I will continue, every one of them I say, for my father's legacy. Putting my signature in The Killer Angels means nothing. But if I sign it for his legacy, at least there's some meaning there. And that's the way I feel. I mean, I am functioning underneath the umbrella of my father's legacy, and that's not a cloud. I mean, there's nothing negative about that, but it's something I never take for granted.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's both a burden and a wonder to deal with it. And we can keep going. Abby, how long do you want us to talk? Keep going? All right. You want to do questions? Or? Yeah.
Yeah, we can take questions, certainly.
We'll do some questions
back
right
here.
there.
Well, first of all, I identify with having to empty the ashtrays in the morning. My parents were at 4-pack a day, but so I have COPD now. Anyway, the reason I want to ask the question is we have the audio books of your Midway book and your Pearl Harbor book, and they're both great. But now I want you to make the audio books of some of the others, because the writing is great, and it's great to be able to listen to them on long trips.
I have a website, jeffshaara.com, and I sell all my books. I autograph everything and sell. And the audio books, I have a few going back. The problem with the audios is they go out of print fairly quickly, and it's annoying. The publisher will have them in print for about 2 years, and then they're done. So I don't have any of the Civil War stuff, and World War II stuff. I don't think I have any, but except for the 2 books you mentioned. But if you go to my website, just look there, and you'll see there's a whole thing under the shop page about audio books, and you'll see everything that's there. So, yes.
That phenomenon you're talking about, you're seeing the father cry, it's more common than you actually think. When I took my dad to the premiere of Gettysburg, at the end, when the credits rolled by, and my father saw my name on the credits, he broke down and cried. And I had to ask my mom why he did that. And she said, because he felt he had never accomplished anything in his life and he was relying on me. And so he was a Korean War veteran. He served in the 11th Airborne and saw combat in Korea. And he always wanted to be a writer. We lived in Key West, Florida in the 1960s, and he was president of the Key West Coin Club, and he wrote a book on coins. And that was his first book, but then he caught cancer, and he never was able to continue writing after that. And ironically, I just retired as curator of a museum in New York State after 25 years, and I discovered writing. And my first book is going to be published shortly, and the publishing company's already contracted me to write 2 more. And I write for Military Images magazine, also on Civil War photography. So I'm doing something like that.
I understand that. Congratulations. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in the back, in the middle, right there. Right, yeah. Hi. How are you?
So in 1987 actually, I was at the University of Notre Dame taking my American Civil War class, and Dr. Robert Kirby assigned Killer Angels as one of our books for a syllabus. And I went into the student union, I sat down in a chair, and I read it in one full read. So what was your first experience reading your dad's book?
I'm sorry, what
was your first experience reading your dad's book?
Not long after, I never read the manuscript. which, by the way, is here in the museum, the original manuscript. I read it right after it came out, and I didn't really know, because my father and I weren't on really good speaking terms around that time. And I didn't know that it had been published until I was driving to work in Tampa, Florida. I was going to my coin business. And the radio news said, you know, FSU professor wins Pulitzer Prize. It's like, you know, like, what is that? And then it started telling the story, Michael Shaara and so forth, and I was flabbergasted. So I went out and got the book and read it immediately, and I've read it numerous times since. Before I started, when I was getting ready to work on Gods and Generals, I read Killer Angels right before, because I'm writing the prequel. I mean, I've got to sort of make it, give continuity there, make it seamless if I can. But yeah, it was quite an experience, realizing my father, in my mind and my mother's mind, the same thing, realizing my father had finally made it big. You know, he'd finally hit the big time. And of course, you know, as I've talked about, nothing much happened.
Yeah, right here.
I've come over from England, especially to visit this place, which I've wanted to do for years, but particularly reading your books on the Civil War and your father's, which I read first. And it's a privilege for me to be here and to hear you speak.
Well, thank you.
But also, I'm wondering, is there a sense in which some of the wounds which people suffered here are still around, in the psyche in the American?
Oh, I think so. I think there are a lot of people, and this has sort of become a joking cliche, the fact that there are some people who are still fighting the war.
Yeah.
But I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, and I can tell you, being a Yankee coming from New Jersey, being in first grade and having them play Dixie, and I didn't know what that was, and everybody stands up. And I didn't know why. And somebody looked at me and said, son, you stand up. I mean, that was my first introduction to the fact that in some places in the South, it's different than some places in the North. And so, you know, in some ways, I think there is that. And some of it's the lost cause myth and all of that stuff contributed to it. Jim Crow, the racial stuff has contributed to it. It's, you know, we are, I mean, it's not a cliche to say we're a divided country, we are, but I think we maybe, we have always been.
Did your dad have any intention, you know, coming out of civil rights, all the things going on in the 60s into the 70s, and then the reinterpretation of the Civil War? I mean, was there any idea in his mind that were the Killer Angels about that, about sort of political, or was it purely the storytelling of the character?
Father was not political. I mean, he never wrote political stories. He wasn't really interested in any of that. On campus at FSU back in the 60s, he was something of an activist. He was in a march against the Vietnam War or something like that. But that's it. I mean, so no, I don't think he had an awareness, a political awareness of what he was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back here on the left. Yep.
Yeah. So one of the photos was of the White House. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yes. When it's typical, and I don't know if this happens today, but it's traditional that if someone wins a Pulitzer Prize, they are invited to come to a state dinner at the White House. So there's you saw the invitations up there. My father and mother were invited. It was Gerald Ford was president, and they went to the White House. My mother sat next to Bill Russell, the basketball player, and Dick Cavett. My father sat next to Henry Kissinger. He got into an argument with Henry Kissinger. I was in Oxford, Mississippi doing an event for Gods and Generals when I was on tour, And there's a great Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi's great bookstore there. And there was somebody sitting on the floor in the back of the bookstore with a sailor hat kind of pulled over their head. And I'm killing time because I don't go on for another half hour. And I look and it's Dick Cavett. And I went up to him and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Cavett, I'm Jeff Shaara, I'm doing the event here." And he said, "Oh, I wondered what that was all about." And I said, "I just want you to know, my mother sat next to you in the White House at a Gerald Ford dinner." And he said, "Oh, he didn't really remember," and he was being polite, and I appreciate that. But I said, "And my father got into an argument with Henry Kissinger," and Cavett says, "Well, whatever the argument was about, I'm with your father." That's as political as I get.
Right here.
I was intrigued by the photograph of the woman kind of in Victorian garb and two children, one wearing looks like a cowboy hat. You mentioned could that be your grandmother and something to do?
No, that is my great-grandmother. And the older child, who's about 5, is my grandfather.
Oh, okay.
And that was taken. Apparently, it's tradition, maybe all over Europe, but I know in Italy that before you went over to the United States, before you crossed the ocean, you had a family picture taken, and maybe to leave with the people you're leaving behind. But that's the only known picture of my great-grandmother and my grandfather as a kid, and one of his own younger brothers. There were 6 more brothers and sisters once they had gotten here, but the 2 of them were the only kids when they were still in Italy.
Way in the back.
Mr. Shaara, your book, The Frozen Hours on Korea, my father was on the Missouri when over there, and he would tell me about it. Yours brought home what he did and the results, because his job was to load 16-inch shells into a second turret of the Missouri and then fire. And Dad would tell me about how cold it was and everything else like that. I want to thank you for bringing that to him. He felt that was an unknown war. And the other thing is I taught American history, and your books were part of my curriculum. And I've got to tell you, it made those eras come alive. The kids loved it. It was one of those kind of things that I'm grateful I had your books when I was teaching.
Thank you. When I first heard about teachers, thank you. When I first heard that teachers were using my books in their classroom, first of all, I was floored by that. It added to the responsibility to get it right, get the facts straight, don't screw around with history. But the other thing, what teachers were telling me is, if you can give the child a character that they can relate to, they don't even know they're learning the history, if they get into the character. And that's the difference between a novel and a straight history book. Not that one is better than the other, but there is that difference.
Thanks for taking my question. So, I've heard you talk about this before, but I don't remember the answer, so I'm going to ask the question. You were approached to write the prequel to The Killer Angel. You weren't a writer. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you? Did it come easily? Was it really hard?
After the success of Gettysburg, when it came out and did what it did, Ron Maxwell contacted me and he said, "Ted Turner wants to make more movies." Ted got excited, and he wanted to do a prequel and a sequel and take the same characters, go before and after the event. You're right, I had never written anything before, but I knew the format that's in The Killer Angels, and I just felt like it was something I wanted to try. Now, Ron Maxwell and I had the conversation that if whatever I come up with, and which he will adapt for a screenplay, it was always about being a movie. But if whatever I come up with is lousy, it goes in the trash. Nobody will ever see it. That's why I wasn't afraid to tackle it, because there were no expectations. I'm representing my father's estate. I'm the businessman in the family in New York. Killer Angels, after Gettysburg came out, Killer Angels also, by the way, besides a Pulitzer Prize, it becomes a #1 bestseller on the strength of the film Gettysburg. So I'm dealing with the publisher in New York who has this #1 bestseller, and I told her what I was doing, that I'm working on the prequel, and it's called Gods and Generals, and she said, "Send us the manuscript." Okay, I sent him the manuscript. The phone call I got back was, we don't care if it's a movie, we like the book. Here's a contract. That changed, well, that's why I'm sitting here. That changed my whole life. So, I mean, I didn't, and as I've said before about Guys and Generals, I didn't feel like a writer still. I felt like I was, you know, taking something away from my father that he, by all rights, was his. And it took me a couple of books to get past that. So.
Thank you.
How are we doing, Abby? Good? All right. Question back there? We'll come over here next. Yeah, right here. You had your hand up?
Me? Go. I
Yeah.
can't tell. Oh, go. Hi, Jeff. How you doing? A few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to do a tour of Evergreen Cemetery with Ms. Novotny. Is she here? Deb, are you here? I thought for sure she'd be here. For those of you local to the area, she was a long-term history teacher with Gettysburg Schools. My daughter loved her. And as we were walking through the cemetery, Killer Angels came up, the Killer Angels came up. And she said she thought she had some sense of how the title came about. And I mentioned, oh, well, I live near Jeff, I'll ask him. I live down the street. Anyway, so my homework assignment is to ask you how your dad did come up with the name.
I don't know the exact answer to that because I wasn't there. But I can tell you just by hearing him talk about it, there is a scene early in the book of Chamberlain. And Chamberlain's talking about how his father, who you know, this scene is not in the movie. This is just in the book. It's a different scene in the movie. But Chamberlain's talking to his father, and he says, you know, Chamberlain has been raised to be very idealistic and very religious by his devout mother. His father, on the other hand, is, you know, wants nothing to do with that. And Chamberlain's telling his father, you know, but there's, and I'm way paraphrasing here, that there's the peace of the angel in all men, that it's a Shakespearean quote. And his father says, well, if man's an angel, he's a murdering angel. And Chamberlain thinks, man, the killer angel. That's where it is in the book. And I think it's the first Chamberlain chapter, I think, actually. In the movie, there's a scene between Jeff Daniels and, well, between Chamberlain and Buster Kilrain, where they're sitting under a tree and they're having the same basic kind of conversation where Chamberlain is talking about his idealism and the goodness of man, and Kilrain is saying, where have you seen the goodness? You know, and Kilrain says, you know, he's a killer angel. I think that was Ron Maxwell's tribute to my father, that he put the title into the movie.
So it has nothing to do with the column with the angel in
No.
the Green Cemetery?
No.
All right. So I'll have to stop saying that.
In the straight shirt right here.
So, Buster Kilrain's an entirely fictitious character. And which, by the way, one of my brother guides had people who insisted they were directly descended from him. But my question is, I read someplace that your father patterned Buster Kilrain after his own personality. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he's sort of a crank, and my father could be a crank. Kilrain is Irish. My father was Italian. But there weren't very many Italians at Gettysburg, so the Irishman fit the program a little bit better. But yeah, Kilrain he's the only fictitious character in the story, and he is very much shaped after my father. And I love, and what you just said, I love that. It's a love-hate thing, because guides will come up to me and say, please tell people that Kilrain is a fictitious character. Because they go up the Little Round Top to the 20th Main Monument, and people are looking at the names of all the dead, and invariably somebody will say, where's Buster Kilrain? And then the guide has to explain. And so, I mean, it's really kind of, it's kind of funny. At the same time, it's, you know, to the guides, it's kind of annoying that they have to put up with this.
I have a question
question about Gettysburg proper, the land. How did your father's book influence your relationship with this space? Other than you as a child going and being with him here, and he wrote the book, and you inherited his legacy to write other books based around his book.
It's a little bit of you know, being that familiar with Gettysburg and coming back here, starting before Gods and Generals, coming back here, I can tell you, one of the first times I was here doing a signing, which had nothing to do with anything I had done, was when the VHS cassette of Gettysburg came out. And we were at the old Greystone History Center, which is no longer there, and Ron Maxwell, Bo Brinkman, and I went in there to do this signing. And you know, Ron Maxwell and Bo Brinkman are getting all the attention because nobody knows who I am, and I'm sort of just sitting back in the corner. And a woman who worked at Greystone came up to me and just started talking to me, and you know, we became sort of friends. And for 30 years, we have been friends, and we've been married for 9. That, you know, coming back here year after year after year, you know, it became very easy to become familiar with this and recognize the positive, recognize the charm here, you know, what there is to be here. But I moved here finally full time because of her.
Thank you all again for being here tonight. I just want to say we're such a fortunate community to have the Shaara family here. None of this would have been possible. None of us would be sitting here tonight if it hadn't been for Michael Shaara and Jeff Shaara's work. I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend and have safe travels home this evening. Thank you.